I was the man who carried the empty coffin off the steamer, and I'm the one who has to tell you what came after. My name is Wash Toomey, and for 42 years I rode the coast trail between the cattle pens of Saltbreak Landing and the hill ranches above it. I rode most of those miles beside a quiet drover named Calder Mott, and the morning the news came that the Whitethorn had foundered off the rocks at Cape Sallow with every soul aboard her, I rode it alone for the first time. We carried that empty coffin up from the wharf because his mother begged us to. There was no body, there were 6 bodies and the sea swallowed the rest, but a mother needs something to bury, and so the box was full of folded oilcloth and a coiled stockwhip that had been his, and we laid it in the dry yellow ground above the bluff while gulls turned over us like torn pieces of paper. Vienne Halloran stood at the edge of the grave in a gray traveling cloak with her hair pinned hard against the wind, and she did not weep where the town could see her. She had been promised to Calder since the summer she turned 19. He had been 22 then, and the two of them used to walk the wharf at evening as if the wharf were their own porch. They were to be married the month the Whitethorn went down. The minister said the words a minister says. Vienne's father, a hard man named Ivor Halloran who owned the chandlery and the bonded warehouse and a great deal of the town's good opinion, stood with his hand under her elbow as though she might fall, and would not let her. I stood across the grave with my hat in my fingers and watched her face. She did not fall. She set her chin against the wind the same way Calder used to set his against a stampede. And when the first clod of dirt struck the lid of that empty box, she made a small sound in her throat that I have never forgotten in all the years between. After I rode her home along the Bluff Road because her father wanted the chandlery opened by noon. She did not speak the whole way. At the gate she turned in the saddle and said, "Lo, so the wind had to work to carry it, Mr. Toomey. He is not in that box." I did not know what to say to her, so I said, "No, ma'am, only what was his," and she nodded once and went inside. Word of the wreck moved up the coast slow, the way bad news always did before the wires came in. By autumn the town had wept what it meant to weep. By winter the empty stone above the bluff had a name carved on it and a year, and the boys in the back of the saloon were teaching new dogs that Calder Mott had been the best drover the Sallow Rim ever raised, and that the sea had taken him for its trouble. I rode the coast trail alone. I drove cattle to the steamer pens alone. I learned how a man's silence sits down on the empty saddle beside him. Vienne did not wear black past the first month. She wore the gray traveling cloak instead and her plain dark dresses, and she ran the chandlery counter the way she had always run it, with a quick clean hand and a slow steady eye. 3 winters in, a banker came down from the inland towns and asked her father for her, and her father came home and told her she would say yes. She said no. The banker rode out at first light. 2 summers after that a captain off a tea schooner asked and she said no again. There were others. She kept saying no. Her father stopped speaking of it after the 5th one, though he did not stop being angry. A man like Ivor Halloran is angry the way the tide is wet, as a condition of his nature. I happened to be in the chandlery the afternoon the 5th one came in. He was a hard, decent man from one of the hill ranches, a widower with a daughter who had outgrown his cooking, and he stood at the counter and held a small posy of meadow flowers and could not start his sentence. Vienne saw what he was carrying and her face went, for 1/2 second, the soft, kind face it had been when she was 19. Then she put both hands flat on the counter and she said, gentle as I have ever heard her speak to a stranger, "Mr. Ames, I am sorry. I am held." He nodded the way a man nods when he has been answered honestly, and he set the posy down on the counter and went out. Vienne walked it through to the back room and put it in a tin cup of water. I never saw her throw it out. It dried in the cup and stayed on the back room sill until the day she walked out of that chandlery, a married woman. I would not have told you those years that I expected Calder Mott to come walking up the wharf one morning. The sea takes what it takes. But there was a thing in Vienne's eye when she counted out a length of tarred line on the chandlery counter that did not belong to a woman who had buried her man. The look of a woman keeping a lamp lit in a room she had not yet decided to leave. The 7th autumn was a wet one. The cattle came down off the ridge into the holding pens with their hides dark from the rain, and the wharf was loud with the bawling of them and the curses of the loaders. And the steamers came in and went out without a let-up, because the inland buyers had got hungry for beef. I was at the chute end on a Tuesday afternoon counting head onto a Liverpool boat when I felt a man come up to my elbow and stand there quiet the way a working hand stands when he is asking for a job without yet saying so. I did not look at first. I finished my count. Then I turned and I forgot the count. He was thinner than he had been. He had a beard the color of wet rope and a long scar down the side of his neck I had never seen on him before, and his left hand sat wrong at the wrist as though it had been broken once and set by somebody who had only done it the one time. But the eyes were Calder Mott's eyes, gray and quiet and a little ashamed, and he stood there with his hat off in his fingers the way a man stands at a graveside, and I knew him before he spoke. "Wash," he said, that was all, just the one word in the voice I had ridden 1,000 miles beside. I have driven beeves through a river in flood. I have stood between a man and a knife. I am not given, as a rule, to feeling my knees go. They went. I caught the top rail of the chute, and I said his name back at him like a question, and he nodded the small, tight nod he used to give when a thing was so plainly true it did not deserve a sentence, and the loaders went on cursing at the cattle as though the world had not just stood up out of the sea. He told me, while we walked the long way around the back of the pens, so the town would not see him yet, what had happened. The whitethorn had broken her back on the rocks at Cape Sallow the way the papers had said. He had gone over with the rest. He had clutched a coil of stowed rope and a busted spar and gone under twice, and the second time he went under he had stopped believing he would come back up. He had come ashore on a stretch of black sand below a fishing village named Tide End, 4 days down the coast, with his head split open above the temple and no notion of his own name. A widow at Tide End, a hard woman named Sarn Doon with 2 boys and a debt of her own, had pulled him out of the surf at first light with a pair of fishing gaffs and bedded him by her stove, and fed him a thin fish broth for the better part of a winter, while he tried to remember who he had been. He could remember the smell of the wharf at Saltbreak before he could remember his own name. He could remember the shape of a woman in a gray cloak at the edge of a fire before he could remember that the woman was Vienne. It came back to him not all at once but piece by piece, the way light comes into a room with a closing shutter, and by the time he remembered, he had a roof over his head and 2 boys looking to him like a father and a debt of his living breath owed to the woman whose stove had saved him. Her elder boy had taken a wasting fever the second winter, and the doctor down at Tide End would not come without coin in hand, and Calder Mott had owed that woman more than coin. "I worked it off, Wash," he said. "I owed her a life. I worked off the doctor. I worked off the second winter when the boats wouldn't go out. I worked off her late husband's note at the cannery. I did not know how long it would be." He stopped walking and looked at me. "Tell me she has waited." I should have told him then. I did not have the words. I said, "Walk up to the chandlery, Calder. The door has not been changed." He went pale under the beard. He said, "Has she married?" And I said, "No, son, she has not married. She has not even tried to," and he closed his eyes and stood a long moment with his hat against his chest. And when he opened them again, I saw a thing I had not seen on Calder Mott's face since we were both young men: fear, the clean, uncomplicated fear of a man about to be answered. We walked up the wharf the long way. The rain had thinned to a drizzle and the lamps were being lit early because of the gray, and the chandlery stood at the head of the wharf the way it had always stood, with its painted sign above the door and a coil of new line in the window. Calder stopped at the bottom of the 3 wooden steps. He looked at me. He said, "If she has changed her face toward me, Wash, if she has the right to have changed it, you will tell me and I will go." I said, "I will tell you. Go in." He went in. I did not follow. I stood at the foot of the steps with the drizzle on my hat, and through the open door I heard the small brass bell ring, and I heard a woman's footstep cross the floor from the back room, and then I heard nothing at all for what felt like a long while. Then I heard Vienne Halloran say, in a voice I had not heard her use since she was 19, "Calder," just the one word, and I heard him say her name back. And then I heard the soft, undone sound of a woman setting both her hands flat against a man's chest, as if to be sure he was made of what he had always been made of, and the soft sound of him bending his head down over hers. And I turned and I walked away down the wharf so they might have their first minute alone in 7 years, and not be witnessed by a man, even a friend. I walked far enough up the wharf that I could not hear them, and I stood at the rail looking at the gray water and trying to credit what I had just put back into the world. I thought of his mother. I thought of the empty stone. The drizzle thickened, and after a long while I heard footsteps behind me, and Vienne came to stand at the rail at my elbow. She did not have her cloak on. She had come out without it. Her hair was wet at the temples, and her eyes were the eyes of a woman who had been told the one thing she had stopped letting herself ask. She did not look at me. She looked at the harbor. She said, "Mr. Toomey, you are the only man in this town who never told me to give him up." I said, "No, ma'am, I was not going to be the one." She nodded. She put her hand on my sleeve a moment, only a moment, and she said, "Thank you for that." And then she went back up the wharf to where Calder Mott stood at the open chandlery door with the rain on his shoulders, waiting. I will not pretend the town swallowed it easy. Ivor Halloran would not have him in the chandlery, no matter that his daughter had near unmade her life waiting. The old man had built his anger into a wall and would not be turned. He sent Calder out the back door on the first night with a hard word and a harder hand, and Calder went without answering. He had not come home to fight Vienne's father. He had come home to find Vienne. She came down the back steps after him in her gray cloak with a lamp held low, and she said, "Where will you sleep, Calder Mott?" And he said, "On the trail." "Same as ever," and she said, "Then I will see you tomorrow on the trail." She did. She rode out on the chandlery's bay mare at sunup with a hamper of bread and salted beef, and a quilt she had stitched the third winter he was gone and never given away. And she found him at the cold camp above the bluff where Calder and I used to bed down when the cattle work ran late, and she sat down on a flat stone and made him eat. He ate with both hands, the way a man eats who has been told for years that he was a ghost and is only beginning to credit that he is not. When he was done, she took his broken left hand between her two hands and turned it over and looked at the way the wrist had healed wrong, and she said, "Who set this for you?" And he said, "A fisherman at tide end." "He did his best," she said, "then I am obliged to him for the rest of my life." They were married 3 weeks later by the same minister who had read words over the empty coffin. Vienne wore the gray cloak. She said she had no patience left for a white dress. Calder wore a borrowed coat of mine because his own had gone down with the whitethorn and he had not yet earned the price of another. Ivor Halloran did not come. Half the town came. The other half stayed in their kitchens and argued, the way a coastal town will argue, about whether a man who had come back from the sea owed the town an explanation. He did not give one. He owed his explanation to one person, and he had given it to her in full at the cold camp above the bluff, with his broken wrist in her two hands. They took a small place out past the cattle pens, a weathered house with a porch that faced the water, and Calder put his name back on the drover's roll and rode with me again the way we had ridden before. The first morning we rode the coast trail together, I did not say a word about how it felt to have a saddle beside me that was not empty. I think he knew. We pushed 100 head down off the ridge through a hard, slanting rain, and he turned his horse the old way and walked them across the river with his bad hand low on the reins and his good hand free for the whip, and I laughed for the first time in 7 years. He did not speak of the tide-end years more than he had to. He sent money down the coast every quarter to the widow who had pulled him out of the surf, in an envelope addressed to her elder boy, who had lived. He never failed a quarter for as long as he drew breath. Vienne kept the chandlery. Her father did not speak to her for 2 winters, and then one cold morning he came out the back door with a coil of new line over his shoulder and laid it on her porch without a word and walked off, and that was the end of that war as far as I could ever tell. A daughter came the second year, they called her June, after a month the sea cannot reach, and a boy 3 years on, a quiet, hardy child named Wash after a man who could not turn down such a thing without weeping. The empty stone above the bluff stayed where it was. Calder went up there once with a chisel and stood a long time looking at his own name carved on it and came back down the bluff without striking the stone. He said to me at the foot of the trail, "Leave it, Wash, a man ought to know what he was almost." I have thought on that sentence for 30 years. I think he was right. I am an old man now, and most of the people in this story have gone on ahead. Vienne went last winter in her own bed, with Calder's hand under hers and June reading aloud from a book she had loved as a child. Calder followed her in the spring, the way a man follows a woman he has been answering across a room for 50 years. They are buried together up on the bluff, near the empty stone that used to bear his name, and now bears only the year the whitethorn went down. Like a wound, the bluff has decided to keep. I rode out there the morning after we put him in, and I stood between the two stones, the empty one, and the one with both their names, and I tried to find a word for what I had been a witness to, for that long, stubborn waiting and the man who had come walking up the wharf to answer it. I could not find a word. So I took my hat off, the way I had at the first grave 7 years on the wrong side of the truth, and I said the only sentence that fit. She was right, I said out loud to no one but the wind. He was not in that box. And I rode back down the bluff toward town, with the sea on my left side the way it had always been, and the empty saddle beside me at last only an empty saddle, and not a thing that owed me a man.